Hi, so in our last CSS lesson, we learned about inline styles. And you recall that there were three kinds of styles. There were inline styles, internal styles, and external styles. Inline styles are the ones that are closest to the HTML. And then inline styles affect the entire page. And then external styles could affect an entire site. So what we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to take a look at the second of the two options, which is internal styles. I'm going to open an HTML starter. It's just a clean HTML page. Actually, I want to be sure to open it in Notepad. And the reason that I'm opening this one up is so that I can demonstrate some things. It's not meant to be your assignment. You don't need to follow along unless you like to, just for the practice. But it's not part of your assignment. It's just for demonstration. So if you recall, last time we worked on the same file. It's just a basic web page. And I just wanted to point out that we used internal styles. We used inline styles, where we put in styles within the HTML selector or the HTML tag or element. And so we did things like we made any given text centered or bold or colored. We affected the background of the body with the background CSS tag or CSS attribute. And so now what we're going to do is the same kind of thing, but we're going to do it as an internal style rather than an inline style. So to begin with, there are it's just a little bit different the way it works. In inline styles, you put in the style attribute inside your tag. So style would equal whatever the value of that style would be, right? And so with internal styles, instead of doing it at the point of the HTML tag, what you do instead is you declare your styles in the head section of the document. So up here in the head section, if you remember our discussion about the head section is elements that don't appear on the page. They're more about control of the entire document. And so the only thing we've used them for so far is the title, which appears in the title bar, not within the page itself. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to create a style section which defines the styles that are used elsewhere on the page. And so you would use the tag style to define that this is going to be the style section. And eventually, of course, we're going to have an end style. Oops, got to spell it right. We're going to have an end style tag. And so within the opening and closing style tags inside the head section of the document, we're going to declare our styles. And so, for example, you might have a style that's called an element selector for, say, H1. Right? So H1 is a tag that we use all the time that defines a heading or a headline of size 1, which is the largest size. Right? And so what we're going to do is in a bracket, not a square bracket, but a curly bracket, we're going to specify what are the attributes of that style, of that element. So let's say, for instance, we said color is red. Okay. So this is the way it works. You just do the name of the element and then the attribute of the element inside these curly braces, right? And it should always be attribute colon value. And now it's really important that you end that with a semicolon. One reason that that's really important is that you can put multiple attributes in the same declaration. So I could do text align colon center. Okay, so I've actually got two declarations or two attributes here within the same declaration. The color of H1s will be red, and the alignment of the text will be centered. Okay, and they're set off from each other with a semicolon. Each one ends in a semicolon. Now, this is a perfectly valid way of doing a declaration. Multiple attributes in the same line, that's no problem at all. However, I will show you another way to do it in just a moment. Before we go any farther, let's see the effect of this, right? So essentially what we're doing is we're defining H1 to be red and to be text align center. Now that's going to affect any use of any H1 anywhere on the page. So far I only have one, which is the headline of the web page right here. So if we save that, I guess I already did. and then view it in a browser, you can see that my headline, H1, is showing up red. Okay, pretty simple. So if we go back to our code, and let's say we change this to blue, and blue is a link, so let's change it to green, and maybe we did text align right. Okay, if we save those changes, and then, oh, sorry about that, I'm trying to bring up our web page. Here it is. Refresh. Now the headline is green and it's flush right. Okay, so you can see how the styles are being used. But what's interesting about internal styles as opposed to inline styles is, if I created a second headline someplace, maybe let's put it here. If I did an H1, without specifying any attribute at the point of the HTML element, here's a second headline. Same size, same color, same flush right. Everything about it is the same. And just to show you, if you go back and change anything, like let's make this pink, and let's make it text align left. If I change the style, okay, I didn't change the HTML at all, just the style, and refresh it, both of my headlines respond. Okay, so essentially what you're doing is you're defining attributes of the HTML element itself, and so that is known as an element selector. Okay, now just to show you some options, one thing that's fairly common with this kind of a style declaration in the head section of a page is that it's fairly common to break up the declaration. Something like this. Why do we do this? Well, the idea of it is just for readability. So you can have one attribute per line. It makes no difference at all if it's all squeezed together or if it's spelled out or if it's some combination. It all works the same. So what's really different about that is that is just for readability. So let's say that we did something like we did a declaration for P, for paragraph, right? We can put in, I always do that, put in our curly bracket, and we can do a, I don't know, color is green, and that's the only thing I want to do to it. And you see my mistake? I did a colon instead of a semicolon. So we can do this, P color green, and this is going to affect all of the places where we used a P. So they call this an element selector because you're defining an element. An element would be like an HTML tag, and then in the HTML you're selecting that element by basically using that element, right? So if we say save to that and refresh our page, now all of our paragraphs are green, and they're all green. Anything that used a P is now green because we redefined the P tag. All right, so far so good. Okay, so now a different kind of a selector is called an ID selector. An ID selector is kind of odd. An ID selector is used for a single instance. So like P is going to affect all of the instances of P anywhere in the document. Now let's say that you had one paragraph that you wanted to be different, just one. Okay, in this case you might want to use an ID selector. So let's say that we created one called green. Well, I don't want to get into the details, right? So let's say paragraph 1 is what we'll call it, right? And in this case, and I'm just going to space these out for readability. They don't have to be spaced out for any reason. So I did it again with the square brackets. All right, so in this case, we're going to do, I don't know, maybe we'll do color is brown. All right, So it looks very similar to an element selector, but what's different in this case is the pound sign. That turns it into an ID selector instead of an element selector, and it will not be used on all paragraphs. You have to specify an ID with this code, and this code is para1, right? So then what we could do is we could come down here to say maybe this one right here, and we could say ID equals para1. All right. So what I've done in this case, kind of like an attribute to a tag, is that I've specified what ID we're going to use. And so when I say ID is paragraph 1, when the browser interprets its HTML tag, it'll get to this point and it'll say, oh, ID paragraph 1, let's go back to the style section and look for an ID that's been declared that uses the name paragraph 1. All right. I'm going to leave it alone. All right, so let's save that. And then when we come back here and refresh our page, if we scroll down, you'll see that there's a single paragraph that is brown. And the rest of them are green. And the rest of them are green because P has been defined as green. This one is brown because it uses an ID of para1, which we define differently than P. All right. Now, the way you're supposed to use an ID tag is it's supposed to be something that's unique on the page. That paragraph and only that paragraph is going to be brown. So then you might ask, well, why use it at all then? Why don't we just use HTML or an inline style to make the paragraph brown? And the answer is you could very well do that. The only reason to do it this way is so that all of your style declarations are in the same place. It makes it easier to control. It makes it easier to go back and deal with, because you don't have to hunt through the HTML to try to find the declaration of an inline style. It's all right in the same style section up top. Okay, so that's kind of the idea behind it. Now there is a go-between, right? So here when we define P, we changed the element. So that's an element selector, and it changed P for the entire document. And here we did an ID of para1, and that was a specific exception or a single instance. Okay, there is something in between, which is called a class. And a class is where you have multiple items that you want to specify the same attribute, but they're not necessarily the same kind of item, although they can be, and it's not all of that item, it's just specifics. So for instance, we could do a class that's like dot center. And in this class, we will say text align is centered. Okay. All right, so the point of this is that whenever we call out or select the class center, it will center whatever it is we want to center. Yes, we could do an inline style, we could do HTML, we could do it in different ways. This is one way to do it. All right. So in this case, let's say this paragraph right here, we said class equals center. Notice that when we call it in the HTML, we don't use the dot. Okay, so the dot is just an identifier for the style declaration to say this is a class. But when you actually call the class, you're using the word class, so you don't need the dot for that purpose. And so here's an interesting thing. We're going to use this class here, and then let's use it on some other kind of element. Maybe here. Did I spell it right? So notice what I did there. I used this class in an H1 and in a P. Doesn't matter. As long as the attributes apply to the kind of content that follows, you can do that just fine. So let's see what happens. Okay, so this H1 is centered because it used the class center. And it's interesting because now I'm using two different style declarations for the same thing. I specified H1 was pink, and then I specified that class center is centered, and both have been applied to this particular tag. Down here, this paragraph has been centered, and again, it's because of the class declaration center. All right. So that's an instance where this particular attribute applies to multiple kinds of things, H1 and P. Now, one other way you can use a class is kind of interesting. You can use a class that is specific to the selector or the element type. So, for instance, trying to think of which one to use. Let's say that we did UL dot red. All right. So in this situation, I'm defining. Gotta go back. I'm defining a class, and that class is red. But I am assigning that class right up in the declaration to ULs only. All right. So we'll say color is red. Okay. Save. All right. So now I have an unnumbered list in my document right here. And so I just declared that ULs will be red, right? So I go up here and I refresh, and my UL is not red. Why not? Because I didn't do an element selector that would have changed all ULs. Instead, I did a class that was specific to ULs. And in order to use that, I've got to call it out, right? So I go down to my UL and I specify class equals red. And I save that, and then I refresh this, and now my UL is red. Okay. So how is that different than any other class? Well, watch this. What if I go up to this paragraph right here and I say class equals red? Save, refresh. Hey, my paragraph's not red. Why isn't my paragraph red? I just specified that its class equals red, just like I did here. And this is red and this is not red. Why? Because up in the declaration, I specified that this class only applies to this element. So if I try to use it elsewhere, it will not work. Okay. So I'm going to try to go ahead then and clean up this declaration, because I know it's not going to work. All right, save. Okay, so we're getting a pretty good style list here. I want to show you one more kind of thing. It's a little bit odd, a little bit confusing. So bear with me, all right? The last kind of thing is called a pseudo class. So you know what? Why don't I take a second and just put in some comments so you can have a documentation here. So this is how you do a comment inside a style, inside CSS. And the comments are not parsed. They're not interpreted by the browser in any way. It's just a way for you to sneak a comment into the code that somebody who's reading the code can view. It's not interpreted by the browser or used in any other way. So I just wanted to say here that this first one was an element selector. Okay, so this is the beginning of a comment, this is the end of a comment. Whatever appears in between is not interpreted by the browser. So this first one was an element selector where we specified how an H1 or a P changes all of the elements of H1 and P throughout the entire document, right? And then we got down here and we did an ID selector, and we created paragraph 1 and or para 1, and it's only to be used for a single instance, right? And then here we did a class selector, and a class selector is used in multiple places but not in every place. So we're not saying all paragraphs are centered, we're just saying here's a center attribute that can be used on multiple things. Here, this is also a class selector, but what's different about this one is that this attribute only applies to this kind of element, and it doesn't have its own name. Okay, and the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do a pseudo class selector. And what's different about a pseudo class selector is that a pseudo class only affects states of an element. So, for instance, a link, which we use the tag A for. So we'll do A:"linked. So what happens here is that a link, like an anchor tag, has 4 states. It has an unvisited state, which means that it's a link that's never been clicked on. And in default HTML, an unvisited link is blue, right? That's why I've offered advice to not make your page background blue, because then your unvisited links will disappear. Second state that a link might do is it could be a visited link, which means you have clicked on it in the past, and your browser remembers that. And so a visited link shows up by default as purple. Again, you don't want to use a page background that's purple because your visited links will disappear. Okay. 2 other states, you could have a hover state for a link. A hover state is when you mouse over, when you put your mouse over the top of a link without clicking. If you have a hover state defined with a pseudo class, you can change the style of a link that's being hovered over. Doesn't matter if it's been visited or not visited, but it'll still change when you hover over it. And then finally, you can have an active link, and that's a link that's in the purpose, or in the point, in the moment of being used. Okay, so a link is an unvisited link, and we could do something like color is, let's pick a color, green, right? And then, and I'm just going to be lazy and I'm going to copy this declaration. And then for a visited link, I would say A:"visited. In this case, we'll make a visited link be orange. Oh, you know what? Look what I did. I left off my semicolon. Can't do that. All right. And then we could have a link that you hover over, and we can make that turn teal. All right. And then we can also have a link that is active. And these are special states. An active state is a state that's pretty hard to witness. So, you know, don't get your hopes up on seeing what that one does. We'll make that one yellow. Okay. So essentially what we've done here is we've created 4 different colors for 4 different states of a link, right? And so we'll save that. And if we haven't made any mistakes, we can refresh this. And what you'll see is that these links, these unvisited links, are green, right? And they're green because in our declaration we said an unvisited link is green. But then if we hover over one of these, and you'll notice when I get my cursor right over on top, the link turns blue. It actually is teal, right? So if we hover over it, it turns teal. And so that's because of a hover teal, right? And then if we visit the link, if we go to that link, I'll click on this one. In the moment, it turned, what did I say, peach? So right when it was clicked on, before the page actually changed, it turned peach, I believe that's what I used. And then if I hit back, it goes back to the page, and now it's orange. And so it's orange because it's been visited, right? So those are 4 different states of a single element, and they call those pseudo class selectors. And notice I didn't do anything to the HTML. I just have standard tags here, standard A tags. I didn't have to specify a class or an ID or anything. So it's like an element selector, but it's specifically states of an element. Okay, I've been going on for quite a while here. Let me just recap a few things real quick and we'll end this video. So first of all, what we're doing here is we're going to change this title now to Internal CSS, because we are creating a list of styles. We're declaring a list of styles in the head section of the document that controls the entire document, instead of doing inline styles, which are at the instance of the HTML. Okay, so we learned 4 different kinds. We did an element selector such as H1 or P that will allow you to add attributes to that element anywhere and everywhere it's used on the page. So I would say that this was for all uses of that element. Okay, then we did an ID selector, which was a special case. So this is going to be for one use of the element. It's a unique use of the color brown for a paragraph that has a special scenario. And then we did a class, and this would be for some uses of that element, not all. Not everything is centered, but when you want something centered, you can call it out. And then this one is states. Link is the best one I can think of. There are probably some other tags that have states associated with them, but the link is used all the time. So that's the one you need to know. Okay, so once again, element, ID, class, and pseudo class. All right, I'm going to end this video now, and then I'll do another video that shows you how to use this in context of your assignment.